Hello, my name's Matt Whitman. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. We're going to talk about Matthew 26 and some other stuff around the book of Matthew here in just a minute. But first, an introduction. Now, I've been thinking about this lately. It seems like there are 4 levels of things that you can say on the internet that correspond to a certain level of intensity of response. It seems like most of the stuff that gets said on the internet is just innocuous. It's funny or an attempt to be funny. It doesn't move the needle. It doesn't matter. It doesn't need to be responded to. Most of that just goes off into the ether, nothing to be gained by replying to it. Then the second level is the kind of stuff, the sort of opinions you could say on the internet where there is a clear, equally and oppositely held opinion. And whatever opinion in this category someone says on the internet, there's going to be somebody else who comes along and says the obvious stuff in reply to it. And they'll dutifully be like, no, if you think about this, it's like, yep, I know. Those are the points. And vice versa. There are some points. And I don't think this really accomplishes anything either. Usually this won't escalate into hard feelings. It's just, oh, surprise, there are people who hold the opposite opinion on this split right down the middle particular issue. Again, pretty innocuous. Everybody takes a turn at some point in their life and trying to keyboard warrior at this level, but it just doesn't really matter. Then the third level is where things start to get a little more delicate. This would be the kind of thing where somebody goes out onto the internet and they say something that is in opposition to conventional wisdom, that is in opposition to whatever the current opinion is about how everything is and ought to be and what we ought to believe about a certain thing. And a lot of times, the current opinion is probably right. And a lot of times, this crazy outlier minority opinion is maybe a little crazy, outlier, and dangerous, but sometimes it's not. Whatever the case, all morality or accuracy of the comment aside, this third level of comment is very dangerous. And in this situation, it's not enough for one person to just dutifully come along and be like, no, not that idea. Like just by merit of such a comment being made on the internet at this level 3, everybody's got to jump in and announce, I also think you are bad and wrong. Did everybody see that I said that they're bad and wrong and that they are wrong? Like definitely super bad and very wrong. Everybody saw I thought that too? Cool. So that's where you're going to get the pile on. But even there, like what's the consequence of when this happens on the internet? Like maybe somebody gets canceled or gets put in the penalty box for a while for having the wrong opinion. If it turns out they were right down the road, they're vindicated, I guess. Nobody ever really like apologizes or anything. Or if they were wrong, no, they just stay wrong. They eat a little humble pie and maybe that's it. The fourth level doesn't happen very often. This is where someone who has a following and who has credibility looks at a situation where you're only really supposed to think about it one way. There is only one approved opinion. And they're like, nah, this is broken. The emperor's got no clothes. And it's precisely because they have a point that everybody is going to need to freak out about that. Because if that critic, if that person pushing back on culture and society is right, then everybody's probably got to change stuff and everybody's probably got to admit that they're complicit in something that's pretty broken and pretty gross. And generally speaking, we don't like a prophet. We, like the people Jesus was criticizing in Matthew chapter 23, would rather stone the prophets, but then later decorate their grave to say how brave they were and how important that was, when eventually their ideas end up being the ones that work out. As we roll into Matthew chapter 26, we are getting to a place where a dude who's saying some very consequential stuff is about to get murdered by a massive conspiracy group who are wildly threatened by who he is and the credibility he wields, who are threatened by how much people like him, how big a following he has, and who are threatened by the fact that he's right, that he's got a point, and that his critiques of the institution they oversee are valid and, worse yet, gaining traction with people. Jesus and the religious leadership cannot both be right. There is no compromise position by which the religious leadership can be like, well, Jesus offers a few important critiques, and maybe we should consider that. No, if Jesus is right on any level, they have no pathway forward should his ideas prevail. He's got to go. And as we were talking about yesterday, this dark turn in the text is something that was foreshadowed and even overtly spelled out on a whole lot of different levels. And one of those levels is demonstrated in how every time throughout the book of Matthew, Jesus goes out and says some big picture, big block of thought stuff about the kingdom and who he is and what God's doing. Every time he says something like that and then wraps up that block of thought, there is pretty immediate resistance, but that resistance is coming from different places of escalating intensity throughout the book. That was a lot to think about. Here's what I mean. You got 5 big speeches around which the book of Matthew is structured. Each of these speeches has to do with how the kingdom is. And at the end of each of those big blocks of teaching that flesh out this idea of what the king and the kingdom are about and where you might fit, we get a repeated statement. And that statement is, and that narrative statement from Matthew to conclude each of the speeches is, when Jesus had finished saying these things. So at the end of the first big speech of Jesus, the Sermon on the Mount, he gets up there and he talks about the reality that there is a kingdom, that this kingdom has a different set of values, that it's upside down, that you can't get into the kingdom even by being maximum behaviorally excellent according to the standards of the Pharisees. No, you would have to bend the knee to the king of this greater kingdom, and the righteousness of that king, I mean, that's the conclusion you come away with, would be what it would take to be received as a son, a daughter, an heir, an agent into this kingdom. So then the Sermon on the Mount wraps up at the end of chapter 7. Matthew tells us when Jesus had finished saying these things, giving us this punctuation to say now the speech is over. Then we roll into the very next chapter, chapter 8, and we see some good stuff and some curiosity and some interest, but we also see the first round of meaningful resistance, and that is from outsiders, Gentiles. They see what Jesus did. They don't get it. They're not sure what to make of the whole kingdom thing. His power's intimidating. And they're like, yeah, just go away. So there's our first round of resistance. And to the original audience, that wouldn't be that consequential because these are outsiders who live in a different region. And like, I don't know, whatever their opinion is, it's fine. But then you move over to Matthew chapter 10, the missional discourse, where Jesus sends the disciples out with the specific message, the kingdom of heaven is near, and go heal people, and you can do miraculous stuff and all of that. And you get to the end of chapter 10, and the first verse of 11, again, punctuates, hey, we're done with another block of thought. You learned more about the kingdom. It's that you have a role in it. And here's how that punctuation happens. Matthew says, after Jesus had finished instructing his 12 disciples, boom, there's that repetition of the formula. And what do you know? The very next thing we get is resistance. This time the resistance is from John the Baptist's disciples, who, along with John, apparently aren't quite clear on whether or not Jesus is the Messiah. And some of the people standing there seem to be indicted for being in resistance to the kingdom as well. And then the pattern continues in chapter 13, where we get the kingdom parables discourse. Jesus teaches in parables to explain how the kingdom's going to grow, how it's going to unfold. And then in verse 53, at the end of Matthew 13, right when it's over, we get this narrative punctuation from Matthew again. It says, when Jesus had finished these parables, he moved on from there, coming to his hometown. And what we discover is now Jesus is going to meet resistance from his own kin, his own people. So again, we see that as Jesus offers more clarity on what the kingdom is, which by default is a critique of what everybody else is doing, at the end of each new block of thought about the kingdom, we see an increase in the consequence of the resistance he's running into. Outsiders, yeah, okay. Ooh, then insiders, like disciples of John the Baptist, that matters a little bit more. And then, wow, his own hometown? Okay, that's getting to be some pretty serious resistance. Skip ahead to chapter 18, which is the fourth of these big blocks of kingdom teaching. This one is a little more intimate. It's about what the community of the kingdom is going to look like as time unfolds. And then it wraps up with verse 1 of Matthew 19. It says, when Jesus had finished saying these things. There you go. The narrative punctuation. Once again, what happens right after that? Some Pharisees came to him to test him. Whoa, okay, now we're getting into pretty meaningful resistance at the end of a block of kingdom thought. Now it's rank and file religious teachers who are getting after him, and the resistance is pretty significant and scales up from there. Then we get to the Olivet Discourse, Matthew 24 and 25, that we just got done looking at, and we get the narrative punctuation from Matthew again in 26:1. When Jesus had finished saying all these things, He said to his disciples, "As you know, the Passover is 2 days away, and the Son of Man will be handed over to be crucified." Then the chief priests and the elders of the people assembled in the palace of the high priest, whose name was Caiaphas, and they plotted to arrest Jesus in some sly way and kill him. 5 times Jesus gives big blocks of kingdom exposition. 5 times Matthew wraps it up with some version of when Jesus had finished saying all these things. But the attentive reader can tell that this 5th time Matthew says after Jesus had finished saying all of these things, he doesn't just mean this last speech he gave. He means all the stuff he came to say about the kingdom. That flow of thought is done, and now we're off and running to the violent and then surprising conclusion to this story. Look, there's certain stuff you can go and say on the internet and nobody's going to care. There's other stuff where everybody's going to pounce on you. Every now and then, somebody's going to say stuff that is so profound and so credible that people's moral compasses are going to be scrambled, and they're going to be willing to do crazy things to push back on that, to ensure those dangerous ideas, those dangerous critiques of their system don't get any traction. In terms of basic human psychology, that would seem to be what's going on right here. But the text of Matthew holds this out as being even more than just basic human psychology and self-preservation instincts in play. The text of Matthew holds this out as having eternal, massive, historical, spiritual implications that are going to play out now that the table is set over the next couple of chapters. Thanks for hanging out with me. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour Podcast. Let's do this again soon.